My wife was standing in our own driveway on a quiet afternoon, carefully unloading groceries from the back of her car, not blocking traffic, not disturbing anyone, not breaking any law, when an HOA representative marched up with a clipboard and an attitude, declared that she was in violation of community standards, dismissed every calm explanation from neighbors who tried to help, insisted that rules mattered more than reason, and then escalated the situation so far that she actually called the police on my wife, never realizing that the woman she had just reported, embarrassed in front of watching neighbors and raised phones, was not only innocent, not only on her own property, but also the elected county sheriff who would soon be deciding exactly how this situation ended. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. My wife was standing in our own driveway on a quiet afternoon, carefully unloading groceries from the back of her car, not blocking traffic, not disturbing anyone, not breaking any law, when an HOA representative marched up with a clipboard and an attitude, declared that she was in violation of community standards, dismissed every calm explanation from neighbors who tried to help, insisted that rules mattered more than reason, and then escalated the situation so far that she actually called the police on my wife, never realizing that the woman she had just reported, embarrassed in front of watching neighbors and raised phones, was not only innocent, not only on her own property, but also the elected county sheriff who would soon be deciding exactly how this situation ended. It had been one of those slow, ordinary afternoons where nothing feels urgent and the world seems to move at a reasonable pace, the kind of day where sunlight sits gently on the pavement and the only sounds are distant lawnmowers and birds arguing in the trees. My wife had just returned from the store, the trunk still open, reusable bags lined up neatly as she worked through them one by one, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She was dressed casually, no uniform, no badge, no outward sign of authority, just a woman at home doing something completely unremarkable in her own driveway. That normalcy is what made the interruption feel so jarring. The HOA woman approached quickly, heels clicking with purpose, clipboard hugged tight against her chest like a shield, her expression already set before a single word was spoken. There was no greeting, no neighborly small talk, no attempt to ask a question or understand the situation. She went straight into enforcement mode, announcing that the vehicle was improperly parked and that unloading groceries in the driveway was a violation under subsection this and clause that. The tone was not informative or helpful, it was accusatory, sharp, and final, as if judgment had already been passed. My wife listened without interrupting, which is something she learned long before she ever wore a badge, because listening often reveals more than arguing ever could. She calmly explained that she was actively unloading groceries, that the car would be moved shortly, and that she was well within the law and on her own property. Her voice was steady, polite, and respectful, the way you speak when you expect a reasonable conversation. The response she received was a dismissive wave of the hand and a statement that would later echo in the minds of everyone watching: rules are rules and exceptions are how neighborhoods fall apart. By then, a few neighbors had noticed what was happening and drifted closer, drawn by the tension more than the words. One neighbor mentioned that this had never been an issue before. Another pointed out that delivery trucks parked longer than this almost every day. Someone else quietly said this felt unnecessary. None of it mattered. The clipboard might as well have been stone. The HOA woman spoke over people, cutting them off mid-sentence, repeating policy language as if repetition could substitute for logic or compassion. Phones started to come out, not dramatically at first, just subtly, held low and angled carefully, because people have learned that moments like this tend to escalate whether they want them to or not. My wife noticed, of course, but she did not change her demeanor. She continued unloading, placing bags gently on the ground, refusing to be rushed or rattled, even as the OA woman's voice grew louder and sharper with every passing second. Then came the threat, delivered casually, almost smugly, as if it were the inevitable conclusion to the conversation rather than a wild overreaction. The HOA woman said she was calling the police, not to ask a question, not to clarify authority, but to enforce compliance. There was a brief pause after she said it, the kind of pause where everyone expects someone to laugh or say, "Surely you're joking," but no one did. She pulled out her phone and made the call right there, describing the situation with a confidence that suggested she believed she was fully in the right. My wife did not stop her. She did not argue. She simply nodded and continued unloading groceries, because sometimes the fastest way to end a misuse of authority is to let it run straight into the truth. The neighbors exchanged looks, some uncomfortable, some angry, some already resigned to the spectacle unfolding in NT of them. A few quietly apologized to my wife, as if this behavior were something they felt responsible for simply by living nearby. When the sirens finally became audible in the distance, the atmosphere shifted completely. Ordinary moments have a way of becoming serious the instant red and blue lights enter the frame. Conversations stopped, movement slowed. Even the HOA woman straightened her posture, as if the presence of law enforcement validated everything she had said and done up to that point. She stepped back, arms crossed, chin lifted, wearing the expression of someone who believes they are about to be proven right in front of an audience. What she did not know, what she could not have known because she never asked, never listened, never paused long enough to consider the person in front of her, was that the woman she had just reported was not a powerless homeowner, not someone who needed to be taught a lesson, and not someone unfamiliar with the law. She was calling officers who reported directly or indirectly to the very person she was trying to intimidate. She was summoning authority against authority without realizing it. As the patrol cars turned onto the street and slowed near our driveway, neighbors instinctively stepped back to give space, phones now openly raised, because everyone sensed that this was no longer about groceries or parking rules. My wife closed the trunk gently, took a breath, and waited, calm and composed as she had been from the start. She did not smile, she did not frown, she simply stood there, grounded and ready, knowing that the truth had a way of arriving right on time. And as the officers stepped out of their vehicles and began to approach, the HOA woman's confidence remained intact, unaware that in just a few moments, everything she thought she understood about power, rules, and authority was about to be turned completely upside down. The first officer stepped forward with a neutral expression and a practiced calm, asking what seemed to be the standard opening question. Yet the HOA woman did not even give him time to finish before launching into her version of events, speaking quickly and confidently, pointing at the driveway, the car, and my wife, as if the entire scene were self-explanatory. She cited bylaws, mentioned complaints, and emphasized that she had no choice but to call law enforcement, framing herself as a reluctant enforcer burdened by responsibility rather than someone who had escalated the situation unnecessarily. The second officer listened quietly, eyes moving between the HOA representative and my wife, already sensing that something about this situation did not quite add up. My wife answered when invited, her tone even and professional, explaining that she was unloading groceries on her own property, that the car would be moved within minutes, and that no law had been broken. She did not raise her voice or attempt to assert authority prematurely, because she understood that respect is most powerful when it is consistent rather than demanded. The HOA woman interrupted again, insisting that HOA rules superseded everything else and that compliance was not optional, her voice sharpening as neighbors shifted uncomfortably behind her. It was clear she was no longer trying to resolve anything, she was trying to win. One of the officers asked for clarification about the specific violation, and when the HOA woman pointed vaguely to her clipboard, the officer requested to see the section she was referencing. That small request seemed to irritate her more than anything else so far, because it required proof rather than confidence. She flipped pages quickly, muttering numbers and headings while the officer waited patiently, and in that brief silence the power dynamic began to tilt. The neighbors noticed it too, because moments earlier she had spoken as if authority were automatic, and now she was scrambling to justify it. My wife stood slightly apart, hands relaxed at her sides, observing rather than engaging, because she understood something important that many people never learn. Authority does not need to perform. One of the neighbors quietly told an officer that this kind of enforcement had been happening more often lately, that people were being written up for minor issues, and that fear had started replacing cooperation in the neighborhood. The officer nodded but said nothing, filing the information away without comment. When the HOA woman finally pointed to a clause, the officer read it carefully, then asked a simple follow-up question about time limits and exceptions. She hesitated, clearly not expecting scrutiny, and said exceptions were at the discretion of the HOA. That was when the officer calmly asked whether discretion had been exercised here at all. The question landed harder than any accusation, because it exposed what everyone watching already felt but had not yet said out loud. There had been no discretion, no judgment, and no humanity. The second officer, who had been quiet until now, looked directly at my wife and asked for her identification, not aggressively but procedurally. My wife nodded, reached into her pocket and handed it over without ceremony. The officer glanced down, then froze for half a second longer than protocol would normally require. His eyes lifted slowly, moving from the card to her face, recognition settling in with unmistakable clarity. He straightened his posture immediately and addressed her by title, his voice shifting from neutral to respectful in an instant. The reaction was immediate and impossible to miss. Conversation stopped. Phones lowered. The HOA woman's face drained of color as she processed what she had just heard, replaying the last several minutes in her mind with growing horror. The authority she believed she had summoned had just acknowledged the authority she had tried to overrule. The neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads, because the irony of the situation had suddenly become undeniable. My wife did not gloat or correct anyone harshly. She simply confirmed her identity, thanked the officers for responding, and asked them to continue as they normally would. That request alone spoke volumes because it demonstrated confidence without arrogance and leadership without intimidation. The officers complied, now fully aware that this was no ordinary call and that every action from this point forward would matter. The HOA woman attempted to regain control, stammering through an explanation that now sounded defensive and uncertain, insisting that she had not known and that she was just doing her job. My wife listened, then calmly explained that not knowing does not excuse misuse of authority and that calling law enforcement is not a tool for enforcing HOA preferences. Her voice was firm but measured, the kind of tone that carries weight because it is grounded in responsibility rather than emotion. One of the officers reminded the HOA representative that emergency resources are limited and that unnecessary calls can have serious consequences, not just legally but ethically. Another officer addressed the neighbors, assuring them that no violation had occurred and that the situation was under control. Relief spread through the small crowd, because tension dissolves quickly once fairness becomes visible. The HOA woman nodded repeatedly, offering apologies that felt rushed and incomplete, her clipboard now hanging uselessly at her side. She backed away slowly, no longer the center of attention, no longer confident and no longer in control of the narrative. The driveway, moments earlier a stage for confrontation, began to feel like a normal residential space again. As the officers prepared to leave, my wife thanked them for their professionalism and reminded them that restraint and clarity are often the most effective tools in maintaining public trust. They acknowledged her words with genuine respect because they understood that this moment would not just be remembered for what happened, but for how it was handled. The patrol cars pulled away quietly, without sirens, without drama, leaving behind a neighborhood that had just witnessed accountability in real time. The HOA woman walked off without another word, her authority reduced to paperwork and embarrassment, while the neighbors lingered for a moment longer, exchanging quiet comments and grateful looks. My wife returned to the groceries, picking up the bag she had set down earlier, finishing the task she had started before all of this began. The simplicity of that act underscored everything because despite the spectacle, despite the misuse of power, life continued, grounded again in fairness and calm, and as the driveway returned to silence, one truth settled firmly among everyone who had watched. Authority is not proven by how loudly you enforce rules, but by how wisely you choose when not to. After the patrol cars disappeared around the corner and the quiet of the neighborhood slowly returned, the neighbors did not immediately scatter the way they usually did when police left a scene, because something about what they had just witnessed felt different, heavier, and more important than a routine disturbance. People lingered in small clusters, speaking in low voices, replaying moments, comparing impressions, and acknowledging out loud what many of them had been feeling for months but had never quite read to say. The HOA woman's behavior had not been an isolated incident, it had been a pattern, and this time, that pattern had finally run into a wall it could not push through. My wife continued unloading the groceries, moving deliberately, not rushed and not shaken, because she refused to let intimidation define the rhythm of her own home. A neighbor stepped forward and quietly offered to help, taking a couple of bags without being asked, and another followed, turning what had started as a confrontation into an unexpected moment of solidarity. No one mentioned titles or authority now. They spoke as neighbors, as people who shared the same sidewalks and mailboxes and frustrations. Someone apologized again for not speaking up sooner in past situations, and my wife simply nodded, understanding that fear has a way of silencing even good people. As the last of the groceries were carried inside, conversations began to shift from what had happened to what it meant. One neighbor admitted that they had been cited for trivial issues more than once and had paid fines simply to avoid trouble. Another said they had stopped using their own front porch because they were tired of being watched and judged. These were not dramatic confessions, but they were honest ones, and each story added weight to the realization that enforcement without empathy had slowly eroded trust throughout the community. My wife listened carefully, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed loosely, her expression thoughtful rather than reactive. She did not promise sweeping change or instant solutions because she understood that trust cannot be repaired with grand gestures. Instead, she explained the difference between private rules and public law, between authority and accountability, and between enforcement and harassment. She reminded them that no organization, no matter how official it appears, has the right to weaponize fear or misuse public resources to assert control. What struck people most was not her position, but her restraint. She spoke about responsibility, about how power demands humility, and about how leadership is revealed most clearly in moments where it would be easy to retaliate, but wiser not to. She explained that the officers who responded that day would file a report, not to punish but to document, because documentation is how patterns are addressed properly rather than emotionally. That reassurance mattered because it signaled that this was not about revenge, it was about boundaries. Later that evening, after the neighbors returned to their homes in the street, settled into its usual quiet, my wife sat at the kitchen table and wrote notes while the memory was still fresh. She documented the call, the statements made, the interruptions, and the misuse of police resources, not because she wanted to escalate the situation further, but because accountability requires records. She had learned long ago that problems ignored tend to grow, while problems acknowledged have a chance to be corrected. Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood group chats and social circles, spreading not as gossip but as a cautionary tale. People shared what they had seen, correcting exaggerations and emphasizing facts, because the truth was compelling enough on its own. The HOA woman did not show up the next day, and when she did return later in the week, her demeanor had changed noticeably. There were no loud confrontations, no threats, and no dramatic declarations, only quiet checks and polite distance. The shift did not happen because someone had been embarrassed, but because authority had finally been challenged by something stronger than fear: clarity. Residents began asking questions they had previously avoided, requesting written explanations and pushing back respectfully but firmly when enforcement crossed into intrusion. The power imbalance that had once felt permanent suddenly seemed negotiable, and that alone changed the tone of daily interactions. My wife never announced who she was to anyone who did not already know, and she never used her position to insert herself into HOA matters beyond that single afternoon. She understood that lasting change rarely comes from dramatic reveals, but from the confidence people gain when they see that unjust behavior can be confronted without chaos. The lesson spread quietly, neighbor by neighbor, porch by porch, until the neighborhood felt a little less tense and a little more like a community again. That night, as we sat together and reflected on the day, my wife said something that stayed with me long after the lights were turned off. She said that the most dangerous kind of authority is the kind that believes it will never be questioned, because unchecked certainty hardens into cruelty faster than people realize. She also said that the most powerful response is not anger, but calm certainty backed by truth. The driveway where it all happened looked exactly the same the next morning, sunlit and ordinary, with no visible sign of the confrontation that had unfolded there. But for those who had watched it happen, the space felt different now, because it had become proof that even small moments can reset the balance when handled with integrity. And though the story would continue to be told and retold in different versions, the core of it remained unchanged. Rules do not outweigh people, and authority does not excuse disregard. In the end, nothing dramatic followed that day, no sweeping announcements or public apologies, and no viral spectacle, yet the impact lingered in quieter, more meaningful ways. The neighborhood breathed easier, conversations became more open, and a single Emmy, Suze of power, confronted calmly and correctly, had reminded everyone that respect is not enforced, it is earned. The following days revealed consequences that did not arrive with sirens or formal notices, but with something far more unsettling for those accustomed to unchecked control: scrutiny. The HOA board, which had previously operated with quiet confidence and minimal resistance, suddenly found itself the subject of questions it was not used to answering. Residents requested copies of bylaws. They asked for clarification on enforcement authority. They wanted to know how often law enforcement had been contacted and under what circumstances. None of these questions were hostile, yet together they formed a pressure that could not be ignored because it was rooted in legitimacy rather than emotion. My wife did not initiate any of this, nor did she attend meetings or make public statements, but her presence lingered in every conversation like an unspoken reminder that authority flows both ways. People realized that rules were not self-enforcing truths handed down from some untouchable source, but documents written by people, interpreted by people, and therefore subject to challenge by people. That realization alone shifted the balance more than any official reprimand ever could. At the next HOA meeting, attendance nearly doubled. Residents who had never spoken before took seats near the front, some clutching notebooks, others holding printed pages of the bylaws they had finally read for themselves. The atmosphere was different, quieter, heavier, and more serious. The board members noticed it immediately, because confidence that thrives on apathy struggles under attention. Routine agenda items took longer. Questions were more precise and vague answers were no longer accepted without follow-up. The HOA woman from the driveway incident sat further back than usual, eyeing eye contact, speaking only when addressed directly. When she did speak, her tone was measured and careful, stripped of the certainty that had once defined her presence. There were no dramatic accusations or public call-outs, yet everyone in the room understood that the incident had become a reference point, a moment against which future behavior would be compared. Power, once exposed, rarely returns to its previous shape. Outside the meetings, the neighborhood continued to change in subtle but meaningful ways. People began using their porches again, lingering in driveways, waving to one another instead of retreating indoors. Small acts of normalcy felt quietly defiant, not because they broke rules, but because they reclaimed space that fear had slowly taken away. Enforcement notices became less frequent, and when they did appear, they were accompanied by explanations rather than threats. My wife watched all of this from a distance, offering advice only when asked and never inserting herself where she was not needed. She understood that lasting stability depends on communities learning to regulate themselves fairly, not on one person stepping in as a corrective force. When neighbors thanked her, she reminded them that the outcome was the result of collective awareness, not individual authority. That distinction mattered because it returned ownership to the people who lived there. Behind the scenes, procedural changes were quietly implemented. The local department clarified guidelines for HOA-related calls, emphasizing mediation over enforcement and reinforcing that police presence is not a tool for settling private disputes. Officers were reminded to ask more questions, to verify legal authority, and to recognize when a situation did not warrant escalation. These were not punitive measures, but preventative ones, designed to protect both residents and officers from being placed in unnecessary confrontations. The HOA woman never approached my wife again, not with hostility and not even with apology. Distance replaced confrontation, which in this case was progress. Some people mistake silence for avoidance, but sometimes it signals understanding arriving too late to be spoken aloud. The clipboard still appeared from time to time, but it no longer led with power, it followed with procedure. One evening, weeks after the incident, a neighbor mentioned how strange it felt that something so ordinary had caused such a ripple. My wife smiled slightly and said that it is often the ordinary moments where abuse of authority hides best, because people assume nothing important is happening. She explained that fairness is not tested in dramatic crises alone, but in how minor situations are handled when no one expects resistance. The driveway where everything began had long since returned to its familiar role as just another part of the house, yet it carried an invisible weight now, like a quiet landmark. It had become a reminder that respect is reciprocal, that rules without judgment are brittle, and that authority loses legitimacy the moment it forgets the people it exists to serve. As time passed, the story settled into the background of neighborhood memory, not as gossip, but as a reference, something people recalled when deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. And each time someone chose to ask a question, to request clarity, or to assert their rights calmly and respectfully, the impact of that single afternoon continued to unfold, proving that real change rarely announces itself loudly, but endures precisely because it does not. What happened next did not unfold in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow and deliberate reckoning that affected people in ways they did not expect. including those who had once believed that silence W as safer than speaking up. As weeks passed, residents began to realize that the most lasting impact of that afternoon was not embarrassment or fear, but permission. The permission to question, to clarify, and to insist on being treated like human beings rather than line items in a rulebook. That shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, but it changed how people interacted with one another and with the systems that governed their daily lives. Neighbors, who had once hurried inside when they saw HOA representatives approaching, now stayed where they were, greeting them politely but firmly, asking what the issue was before accepting any explanation. Conversations that would once have ended with frustration now included follow-up questions and requests for written clarification. This was not rebellion, and it was not hostility, it was awareness. People had seen, with their own eyes, that authority did not collapse when challenged respectfully, and that realization took root quietly but firmly. The HOA board, sensing the change, attempted to reassert control through formal communication, sending out emails reminding residents of community standards and enforcement procedures. Yet the tone of those messages had shifted noticeably. Words like must and will were replaced with please and as outlined, and enforcement notices now reference specific sections rather than vague authority. These changes were small on paper, but significant in meaning because they reflected an understanding that unquestioned power had limits after all. My wife continued her work as county sheriff without drawing attention to herself. Yet her approach in other areas reflected the same principles that had guided her that day. She emphasized training on de-escalation, reminded deputies that their presence carries weight even when no action is taken, and reinforced the idea that fairness is not demonstrated by force, but by consistency. She understood that leadership is most effective when it shapes culture quietly, not when it demands recognition. One afternoon, a resident from the neighborhood reached out privately to thank her not for the incident itself, but for what it had changed internally. The resident admitted that they had spent years feeling small and powerless, believing that challenging authority would only make things worse. Seeing calm resistance succeed without chaos had altered how they viewed themselves. My wife listened carefully and responded simply, saying that courage often looks like composure, and that standing your ground does not require standing on someone else. The HOA woman, meanwhile, found herself navigating a different landscape than before. Her role had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped by boundaries she could no longer ignore. She was more cautious now, more precise, and noticeably less confrontational. While some interpreted this as fear, others recognized it as something healthier: accountability. Power, when tempered by oversight, often becomes quieter, and quiet power is easier to live alongside. In the broader community, the story continued to circulate, not as a boast or a threat, but as an example. It was told carefully, with emphasis on behavior rather than identity, and on restraint rather than dominance. Each retelling reinforced the same lesson: rules exist to support communities, not to intimidate them, and enforcement without empathy ultimately undermines the very order it claims to protect. At home, life returned fully to normal. Groceries were unloaded without incident. Neighbors waved from across the street. Evenings were once again defined by ordinary sounds rather than tension. Yet beneath that normalcy lay a shared understanding that something important had shifted. People felt steadier, more confident, and more connected to one another, because shared experience has a way of building quiet alliances. One night, as we sat together reflecting on how far-reaching the effects had been, my wife remarked that the most meaningful outcomes are rarely the ones you can point to directly. She said that justice is not always about correcting a single wrong, but about preventing the next one by changing expectations. When people expect fairness, they are less willing to accept abuse, and systems adapt accordingly. The neighborhood had not become perfect, and disagreements still arose, because no community is without conflict. But the way those conflicts were handled had evolved. There was more conversation, more patience, and more willingness to pause before escalating. The fear that once kept people silent had loosened its grip, replaced by a collective sense that calm resistance was not only possible, but effective. As time went on, the incident faded from daily conversation, but its influence remained embedded in the way people behaved. It had become part of the community's unwritten history, a reference point that quietly guided choices and responses. And while no plaque marked the driveway where it all began, the lesson it carried was understood by those who needed it most. Authority earns respect when it listens, and power becomes legitimate only when it remembers the people it serves. The true ending of the story did not arrive with applause, punishment, or public statements, but with something far more lasting, a changed understanding of what fairness looks like when it is practiced instead of preached. Months after that afternoon, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place where people measured their behavior out of fear of enforcement, but like a community where expectations were clearer and respect moved in both directions. The shift was not dramatic, yet it was undeniable, because tension has a way of announcing its absence through calm. People began trusting their instincts again, trusting that standing on their own property or living their ordinary lives did not require permission from anyone holding a clipboard. Porch lights stayed on longer in the evenings. Conversations lingered at the ends of driveways. Children played without parents, constantly scanning for someone who might object. These were small freedoms, but they mattered because they restored a sense of dignity that had quietly been worn down over time. The HOA board, perhaps recognizing that legitimacy depends on cooperation rather than control, continued operating with more transparency than before. Meeting notes were clearer, enforcement actions were explained instead of imposed. When mistakes were made, they were acknowledged rather than defended. Not everyone was satisfied all the time, but satisfaction was no longer the point. Fair process was, and that alone reduced conflict more effectively than any warning ever had. My wife never referenced her role again in relation to the incident, because she understood that the moment had served its purpose. Authority revealed once does not need to be displayed repeatedly. In her work, she continued, emphasizing the same principles that had guided her that day: patience, clarity, and restraint. She reminded her deputies that the public remembers not just what officers do, but how they make people feel while doing it, and that trust is built in the quiet moments long before it is tested in loud ones. Occasionally, a new neighbor would hear fragments of the story and ask about it, expecting something dramatic or triumphant. The answer was always simpler than they imagined. It was about groceries. It was about a driveway. It was about someone choosing rules over people and someone else choosing composure over ego. The lack of spectacle often surprised them, but that was the point. Justice handled correctly rarely looks cinematic, it looks calm. The HOA woman eventually moved on to a different role, and while no one spoke openly about the reasons, there was a general sense that the environment she left behind was healthier than the one she had helped create. Her departure was not celebrated, because the goal had never been to remove a person, but to correct a pattern. Patterns can change when they are confronted with clarity instead of fear. For us, the memory of that day settled into something reflective rather than emotional. It became a reminder of how easily power can slip into misuse when it goes unchecked, and how quickly it can be recalibrated when met with steady resolve. My wife often said that the most dangerous assumption anyone can make is believing that no one will ever challenge them, because challenge is not an attack, it is a safeguard. The driveway remained just a driveway, indistinguishable from any other, yet it carried a quiet lesson for those who knew the story. It showed that you do not need to shout to be heard, that you do not need to threaten to be respected, and that you do not need to reveal who you are to insist on being treated fairly. Calm truth, presented without hostility, has a way of standing its ground. In the end, no one won in the traditional sense, and no one needed to. What mattered was that a boundary was drawn, clearly and respectfully, and that boundary held. The neighborhood learned that authority is strongest when it listens, that rules exist to serve people rather than overshadow, and that the good guys do not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they are already there, unloading groceries, quietly prepared to stand firm when it matters most.